Right. So let's now apply what we just learned, right, to an actual service that is more familiar to what we are doing in our assignments, right? So, for instance, in our assignments, we have lots of domain objects. Well, not only we have users, we have services, categories, and frequently asked questions. We have lots of domain objects, right? Let's look at one of them. It's a service, the service. So our service might have functions such as, find all services, or find service by ID, or find all services for a particular user. Right? These might be things that you might have implemented, maybe Team 1 or Team 2. I'm not sure. And this service might be using a repository. So this is a slightly different architecture. Up to this point, we've been using controllers as services, right? We've been using the controller as a service. Where you have the controller directly using the repository. Yes, right. A better implementation might have been to decouple the controller, right, from the repository and putting a service layer in between. Right? That might have been a better architecture, right, where you have the controller dealing specifically with HTTP level stuff, right, being able to convert JSON stuff to Java World and Java World back to JSON, right? That does the layer in between these two worlds, right? The stream world with the object world, and back and forth, right? And still the repository is the same thing. The repository would be a layer object, right, or layer that dealt with the communication between two worlds, right? The object world and the relational world, right? That did the shuttling back and forth between a flat world of tables and records and the hierarchical, temporal, ephemeral world of objects, right? Of short-lived objects. In between, typically, we want something that is neither one or the other, right? We want something that is purely Java, right? Purely Java. And this is what we might have, right? We might have an interface that declares a generic service, right? That we would like to create a service that talks to that uses some data source and provides this data to to anyone who needs it, regardless of whether this is a web controller that is accessing it. Right? This service can be used by anybody, not necessarily only by the controller, the HTTP controller, right? So this could be used by anyone else in any other data layer or any other layer in your application, not only necessarily the HTTP controller. So here's our default service, which is it's an implementation of that interface, right? That actually uses a repository to actually implement those functions, right? Those methods. So find service by ID is using the service repositories find service by ID. And so each one of the functions and methods would be implemented here, which use the auto-wired service repository. I'm not going to go into every single one of them. Now the service controller can auto-wire a service, and then use it to proxy to invoke those service calls once an incoming HTTP request comes in. Right? Again, this is a better implementation using this intermediate service in between. Okay. All right. So now that we have this service, we can mock it. Right? We want to be able to test this controller. Notice that the controller is using the service to go and fetch actual data from the database, right? So we can't test this controller without severing, the dependency of this controller with things that are downstream, right? That are actually hitting the database. So to test the controller all by itself, we need to mock that service. We know that service has a whole bunch of functions in there. Find by ID, find all services, find services for a particular user. We need to mock all those things, right? So let's do that. So we know that services are made up of categories, right? I'm sorry, that a service might be in multiple categories, right? And a category might be in multiple services. So let's build an entire service that might be associated to multiple categories. So here it is in our test. We are building our mock data, right? That would be returned by a find service by ID. We want to find our wedding service or whatever, right? And that service, when it comes back, we'll have a title, we'll have an ID, we'll have all the categories that it's in, right? So we can build all that for ourselves, right? So here we're creating 2 categories, category engineering and training, and we're creating a list of all the categories, right? Once we have that list of categories, we can then create a service for ourselves called a web dev service. I provide web development services, right? And that service can be either in an engineering category, or it might be in training category, right? Same skill, but used in different categories of services, right? Either teaching or out in the world. So here's our service web development, and that service, we're adding the categories that this particular service is in. So we've built an entire object that we might have retrieved instead from a database, right? If we've gone out to the database, we might have retrieved this object from the database, yes? But we want to sever that. We want to sever and say, no, there's no need for you to go into the database. I'm going to configure and say that if you would have gone to the database, to try and find a service whose ID is 345, this is the object you would have gotten. This is the object you would have gotten, right? So that when the controller actually tries to go out to the database, they're actually going to get that object that I just created. Make sense? Right? So now I can do my test. I can try out, test my service, find service by ID, and when it comes back, right, I can parse the response and say, do you have an ID of 1, 2, 3? Actually, that's wrong. It's not 1, 2, 3. What is it? I think it was 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 3, 4, 5. So it's 3, 4, 5 here and 3, 4, 5. There we go. So do you have an idea of 3, 4, 5? Yes, I have a 3, 4, 5. And do you have 2 categories? Right, the service categories, right? It's an array. It's an array of categories. Is the array is it 2? Yes, it's got 2. We can check to see. We can even go into the array, right, of categories, and we're saying search all the elements in that array and compare all the titles, right? Which is pretty cool, right? It iterates over all the elements in that array and compare all the titles. There should be at least one that is engineering and one that says training. Okay, very, very powerful. And then we can check to see that the structure of the object is what we would have expected, right?